for those of you who are back, Ramona, welcome back, and the new faces in the crowd, great to have you. Of course, this is the second in the seminar series of three as part of the Clarkson Week, and Professor Antoine Picon, who is both, last time I was maybe a little too informal to say that he's both, he has positions in both a School of Architecture and a School of Engineering, and so perhaps this will explain some of his interest and even expertise in these matters that he's talking about. So both at the GSD and at the Ecole Nationale, which doesn't translate very well into English. We were just talking about the School of Bridges and Roads.
Something like that. Yeah.
But as some of you who took my class will remember, this is a prestigious School of Engineering because it has its, I guess it claims to be the first, right? It perhaps is the first.
In civil engineering, probably. Military engineering, there are a couple of older institutions in the Spanish Empire.
And it was also the home of Doctoral, the theorist whose drawings and you also see in my class I heard about. So today, as you can see, structure from technology to society, which I think Antoine tells me is going to take a little bit more of a historical excursion than to fold on back to the theoretical issues that were raised yesterday.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'm going, to do something a bit different from yesterday. Yesterday, I tried to present a very broad overview of a certain number of questions. Today, I'll try to dig a bit deeper, dealing with a historical case related to the emergence of structural thought in 18th century France. But I hope that part of what I'll say, will relate. It's actually related to this more general issue I alluded to yesterday, which is, kind of epistemological take on construction notion. So actually, the main purpose is really to try to show you how the notion of structure appeared in a given context, how it's linked. When I say to society, how it's linked to cultural, but also social issues. So I try to show you that, and then, take a bit, again, a broader view on what happened later in the history of the development of structural thought. And tomorrow we'll return to very concrete issues with digital culture and architecture. But I think it's not a bad thing to also have a more closer look at a certain number of problems. So like yesterday, do not hesitate if something is a bit unclear, because I know I do this. So we have perhaps, for the picture at least in one of them. I think it should be enough, but let me know if it's not enough. But so the fundamental argument is that, contrary to what we often imagine, and we have a tendency to naturalize the notion of structure as we know it today, as if it was always with us, it's actually something that developed past a certain point in architectural and engineering thought. So I'm going to argue that actually the way we know it today is not how it existed before. Before that, especially if we look at the Western architectural tradition, we have a notion that played a key role, which is solidity. Solidity, which is a bit different from, and which is also quite adverse to the way we understand structural thought today. So to begin, one has to imagine that, from the Renaissance on, what was pervasive was the idea of a world which was ruled by order and proportion. The idea that the world was a giant architecture that was ruled by ratio of commensurability between parts and whole, etc., which was at the core of architectural theory through the question of the orders. And, and architecture was seen as a kind of prototype of the way, more generally, the universe was organized. Hence, the number of speculations regarding the Temple of Jerusalem and the proportion given by God to it. Because as a theologist of the 17th century put it, God had probably created the world by giving it order and proportion. So, and this thing to note, by the way, was that engineers, when they reasoned, they very often used the same frame. For example, you knew, if you were a bridge builder, you knew that typically a bridge, there should be a proportion between the width of the piers and the span of the arch that was between 1/4 and 1/6. And engineering treatises were full of recipes of that kind. So that was a kind of prototype. In that world, there was supposed to be a strong connection between visual appearance and the way things stood. And I said yesterday, Gothic was not solid. Why was it not solid for, let's say, a 17th century person? Not because it did not resist, because actually, the average Gothic cathedral was already 4 or 5 centuries old in the 17th century, but because actually they did not look solid. They looked too thin, too frail, as if literally the vaults would fall on your head. So this impression that something was missing, and that because something was missing, which was the deep harmony between the impression of solidity and the way things resisted, there was some frailty in the affair. So the notion of solidity presupposed that there was actually a deep connection between appearance and reality, which is something we've never totally abandoned in architecture. Still today, we tend to be reassured by some proportion, not so reassured by other, and we often cover steel parts by something to make them thicker. So this is still something that is a bit present, but which was very present before. So a couple of consequences. The first is that the notion of structural performance had no real interest. Even if people weren't ready to admire structural masterpiece as we interpret it today, like the dome of Brunelleschi, the cupola of Brunelleschi, let me remind you that the cupola was mostly admired not as a technological tour de force, which was borderline for architecture, but as a miracle of harmony and proportion. And many things were actually very often seen, once again, in this frame of order and proportion. So I would argue that at the time, a lot of things we associate with structure, like performance, the idea also that structure is different from appearance. I'll come back to that later. All these things did not really have an importance in the Vitruvian frame that reigned, let's say, until the end of the 17th, 18th century. A couple of supplementary things have to take into factor to understand why that. The first one was the predominance of the wall. We think of architecture for a very long time, even if a lot of things were said about orders, columns, etc. Baroque and architecture is mostly about the wall, like here in this Guarini Palazzo in Turin, the Carignano Palazzo. Second thing, if you look at the most common monuments were not the Greek temples, they were the Roman masses. And so this vision of the wall of masonry, etc. Well, and that was actually the main model, and that was really solid. And the last factor I wanted to mention, which I already mentioned yesterday, is this idea that materials had a structure in some ways, or had an organization. So was there really a domain in which what we call today structure reigned was not so clear as it was to become later. Okay, so that's end of part one. I tried to be a bit shorter than yesterday, but no promise complete. So the 18th century turning point. I like actually to evoke in the French case, but actually a similar history through different kinds of buildings could be written in different countries, in Britain, in Italy, etc. France has a kind of paradigmatic, probably, character, because also it's related to the rise of engineering, and also because of a series of experimental buildings that are all the more interesting that they were actually technologically dead ends. So we're going to see a series of buildings which really frame the modern approach of structure, but actually did not have posterity in the 19th century. But actually they paved the way to the understanding, for example, of Iron architecture as structure. I'll come back to that. So the first actually is, strangely, late 17th century, from the 1670 on, the colonnade of the Louvre. I won't enter into all the details. This is about giving to the east of the Louvre a monumental facade, which was supposed to be the new facade of the Palace of the King, at the time when Louis XIV had not definitely settled for Versailles. So the interesting thing is that it's a Roman peristyle. But already we may note it's a very huge building by Roman standards, hence the fact that there are double columns, and which was quite a big debate already, because the double column is something we did not found in Greco-Roman architecture, and the only justification it was because the peristyle was big. So you had actually to stabilize it by these double column thing. So to have an ordinance of columns that is related to scale was a problem already. It was a problem, and it's a building very much linked to something I won't enter into detail, but the quarrel of the ancient and the moderns. Can we overcome, or can we surpass what the ancient had done? So scale really there again mattered, and this quarrel of the ancient and the modern has some relation with what I'm going to say, because in some ways structure was gradually seen as something in which the modern would definitely surpass the ancient. So a huge thing, but the most interesting thing that was really the source of endless debate was that so performance also with sometimes although gratuitous thing. Claude Perrault, one of the main protagonists of this project, imagined, for example, to have monolith stone on the two sides of the pediment, so which entail moving huge stone from the aquaries. And remember, by the way, this is already a political statement, because this is an engraving that is slightly reminiscent of the album of Fontana, showing how the obelisk of the Vatican Piazza is moved. And actually to be able to move that big mass, etc., is a statement about power. And actually the colonnade, if I had more time, is intimately linked to the quarrel between the king and the pope, and who is going by the end to prevail. So politics is already moving in this affair. More interesting for us, we begin to see that this is a strange building, because if you look at the travation, if you look at the lintels, you begin to see these lines which indicate that actually they're not monolith, like in the Greco-Roman tradition, but they're vaults. Actually, they are flat vaults with voussoirs, which means that actually you have something that looks like a Greco-Roman temple, but a Greco-Roman temple, a Greek temple, among other things, weighted in a vertical way. It's a heap of stone, very literally, whereas here you have vaults, which means that you have horizontal thrust, which means that you have a building that already begins to function in a totally different way from the spatial model it's supposed to be based on. Okay? And actually, if you look at the colonnade, it's as if this was like, you have horizontal thrust, and part of the thrust is counterbalanced by the stability of the pavilions, the central pavilion and the two pavilions at the extremities, which acts a little bit like abutments. So you begin to see something which is very different from what it's supposed to be initially. And it goes even worse, because when you go into the structure, you realize that it's totally filled with iron ties. The whole structure, it's filled with iron all over the place. You can see you have here vertical iron rods, then above all horizontal rods to stabilize for the vault, and you have clamps linking the voussoirs in case there was a stability problem. So you begin to discover, and then you have these crosses here in the depth of the inner vaults of the colonnade. So you begin to realize that it's actually an iron frame that you are facing. So you have a building which looks like a Greco-Roman temple, but has an iron frame in it. So the least one can say is that it's a bit problematic in terms of classical solidity, because it does not function in the way it looks like. So what you begin to see also is the possibility of a dissociation between the things, the way things look architecturally, and the way they're built. And so that is already jeopardizing this notion of solidity, and all that in the name of performance, because one has to build at a larger scale than the Romans. This is pretty much the message of the building. So you begin to see that that's a bit problematic. Well, I don't know. Yeah, and furthermore, with a kind of strange organic for Perrault, the justification of the iron is linked actually to his theory of the body. So just to explain to you what this means, Perrault has a very strange, by the way, vision of the body. You know that in the 17th century, Descartes, for example, had explained the body as a mechanics. which is also a very important thing in the affair, structure will derive actually from an understanding of the body as a mechanical assemblage. And for Descartes, basically, how do you explain the movement of the muscles? It's through, you inflate muscle through small particles called animal spirit, which the brain blows continuously, like, you know, a wind in a pipe, in a bagpipe. So, for example, if you turn your eye, the brain sends in this muscle a lot of animal spirits so that it inflates like a balloon, and then it shortens, and the eye turns. Okay? So Picon has a this is the Cartesian thing, which means that basically the body for a Cartesian, orthodox Cartesian, is a kind of limp, naturally limp, and tension is created by blowing, if you want, animal spirits. So you might wonder what this has to do with the colonnade, and for that you have to understand Picon theory is the reverse. Naturally, bodies are in tension. And what the animal spirit do is the reverse from the Cartesian. Picon is a neo-Cartesian with a different theory. Actually, what the animal spirit do, they dissolve the tension that is naturally present in the muscle. For example, if you want to understand, it's like a cable, it's like a mast on a boat which is stabilized by two ropes in tension. If you cut one rope, the mast will go the other direction. Okay? And he gives the other image. Naturally, let's say you're like that, and if you dissolve one tension, there are two opposite muscles, they're always opposite muscle for him, and your arm will move in that direction as if you cut there again a rope. Okay? So that makes for Picon the colonnade more envisageable and justifiable, because in some ways what the iron does in the colonnade is what the muscle naturally in tension do in the body. So you begin to see also a nexus of things which coordinate this new vision of what is really happening within the material and the understanding of nature and the bodies, etc. And these organic metaphors will stay throughout the 18th century. So it has, of course, a link with ideas of skeleton also. And the colonnade is like a giant skeleton, if you like. But a skeleton in which the muscle is the iron. Okay? So this is the starting point, actually, of a series of absurd buildings, which will actually be built throughout the 18th century. The first proposal from these absurd buildings is actually a proposal by Picon himself, a project late in his life for the reconstruction of an abbey, the church of the abbey of Sainte-Geneviève, which was the patron of Saint Patron of Paris. And what Picon basically proposes is to have to replace the traditional massive pillars of Renaissance and Baroque churches by isolated columns. Why is this absurd? Because they carry a vault, which seems totally adverse to the idea, because a vault has thrust, etc., etc. You may note something here that begin to resemble like to a flying buttress. I'll come back to that in a moment. And you see here how it looks in profile. So with the idea that in a way you could have a colonnade effect in a church. So it's a pretty weird idea in structural terms, but this is going to develop throughout the 18th century. And this is very adverse to the traditional way in which, to counterbalance the thrust of the vault, you have these very thick, massive pillars in the middle of the churches, which, by the way, hamper the view, so that actually there is no easy visual connection between the two lateral naves and the central nave. This is typically what you experience in St. Peter. Okay? So at the Chapel of Versailles, you begin to see a transition. The lower floor has still pillars, and then the upper floor has columns. It's not a big structural problem there, because actually the vault is deep. It's a light vault. But then the surprising thing is that it becomes transposed. So this is roughly 1715 or something like that. And then by the 1740s, 50s, you begin to have these huge churches in which you have massive vaults on isolated columns. This is the Cathedral of Arras in the north of France. The city from Ware Travelstead, by the way, would later come. And actually, this is already a church with flying buttresses in the Gothic manner. I'll come back to that in a moment. So, and then it develops, and you will find a number of those churches. This one I showed yesterday, this is in Rouen, the Madeleine of Rouen, which is there again. You can see the vault and the isolated columns. So, and Boulay will also enter into that. The famous project of the Cathedral of Boulay is actually a freestanding column church in the manner of those I've showed you. And of course, speaking of scale, this is much more massive and of course almost unbuildable. So the interesting thing is that we have a whole series of writings which explain to us why this is a good thing to do. And the most famous, so there are probably 10 to 15 major treatises on this question. The most famous is Logier, in which Logier explains to us basically that these freestanding columns are a transposition of the primitive heart. So, which is, and the trunks are replaced by columns, but this is what we should aim at for architecture, and modern churches are actually a transposition of the primitive heart, which is a really interesting thing, because the first thing to understand is Logier does not believe really that men initially built a primitive heart. The primitive heart is a convenient story to tell us the profound reasons of architecture. The profound reason we should note is utility. Why is the heart good? Because it's useful. And so there is a usefulness, fundamental usefulness of architecture through this archetype of the heart. So then we begin to realize that this school story is actually linked to the rise of new social values like public welfare, utility, etc., etc. Then, of course, what does architecture is to transpose the model into something slightly different, because all these churches do not look like primitive heart. So what it does is actually to transpose it into the moral realm so that the church becomes a meditation on the primitive heart. The church becomes a meditation on society. What brings together man is actually need. And you know, this is the fundamental tenet of 18th century political theory. What brings together humans is the need for mutual help, the social contract of Rousseau, Locke, and others. So we begin to understand then that these churches are also rooted in the idea of the social contract, which is already what is often referred as a secularization of religion, because actually churches do not convey the greatness of God, etc. They convey something like the trace in the present of the initial original social contract. Am I clear so far? So that's a key moment in which you begin to understand that something is beginning to be woven together between new social ideals and a kind of structural thinking, emerging structural thinking. Furthermore, this is not completely finished. Why is gradation beautiful, if you look at that? Because it does not have the impurity of the vault transforming itself seamlessly into the column. Because this is less beautiful in the 18th century mind to have an arch that transforms itself into a pillar or a column. Why? Because here you have a total distinction between what is supporting and what is supported. You have the clarity in the column, the clarity of what is put right there, you know, without this negotiation between the two. So it has the absolute purity of the kind of perfect chemical assemblage. Okay? And everything being distinguished and then put together rigorously. So, and this is why I explained yesterday that this is related also to the analytical trend of the 18th century. The vision that if you want really to understand something, you have to decompose it into elements and then reassemble it through combination of elements, which is the basis from Locke to Condillac and from Condillac to the ideologists of the late 18th century of theories of language. Language is derived actually from primary sensation that are then assembled to give birth to more elaborate judgment that are then constitutive of language. Hence the dream of a reform of language in the 18th century by people like Condillac. Condillac's last books will be about the reform of language, with the idea that one should go back to the natural origin of language. With the idea that this is a treatise on the analysis of ideas, written by an engineer, interestingly, at the end of the 18th century, in which what you see here are supposed to be the elementary sensation. For example, I experience pain and I experience pleasure. From that, I'm gradually going to construct abstract notions like good and bad, etc., etc. So what this kind of travation thing has, it has the rigor of a kind of assemblage that is almost linguistic, okay? And this is, by the way many 18th century philosophers understand how should we reform reality. Not by completely imagining something else, but rather trying to understand what are the true constitutive fundamental elements of reality, and refining them and assembling them with a greater purity, which is what, for example, Diderot proposes in terms of manufacturing reform, but what also is at stake with Laugier Hutt. It's to replace the impurity of elements that are not properly distinguished, the supported and the supporting, with something that is clear and very clearly distinguished. And this is here actually what is at stake is the reform of language and thought, following that kind of pattern. One of the prototypes that for the 18th century mind that shows the fecundity of such an approach is actually chemistry. Because what Lavoisier does when he decomposes and recomposes water and air is actually to show that nature itself is a combination of elements. And all that science and technology can do, and eventually architecture, is actually to decompose and recompose elements. Okay? So we begin to understand a bit better all this stuff. But then there are more other reasons behind that we have still to unpack, which is this idea of visual transparency, which I already mentioned. Why is visual transparency important in the 18th century? Visual transparency will have as a consequence also in many Gothic churches the destruction of the wall separating the choir from the nave. They're almost none surviving in France because they were all demolished not by the revolution but actually before. Why? Because what becomes important is actually the people in the church looking at each other, with the idea to return to the kind of antique model. After the primitive hut came the basilica. And what was the basilica? Initially, it was a meeting point, places where the collective body of society could look at each other. And there is another program in which this becomes extremely important, which is our theater. And when Ledoux, for example, puts this eye that looks at the theater of Besançon that he designed, the theater actually is seen as a unified space, contrary to the traditional Italianesque opera and theater in which you have separation. So that actually the spectacle, and what the eye says is that actually the spectacle is as much in the theater with the assembly of people than on the stage. And this is actually why also the theater, what is represented on the stage is actually the theater assembly. And of course, one of the models for Ledoux at the time is the antique theater, the Roman and the Greek theater in which the crowd can see itself. And interestingly, that will be also the model for the first assembly room of the Revolution, which reinvent actually the Greco-Roman theater, but that time for the political body of the representative. So we begin to see there again this question of visual transparency. In a way, the true mystery in this new secularized church becomes not what's happening on the altar, it's the presence of the community. So once again, society. Is that clear so far? Good. So let's move a bit forward. Now this is inseparable from another aesthetic also consideration. We have one theorist who explained to us why also this was beautiful beyond the primitive or whatever, the analytical, which is a guy called Julien David Leroy, major theorist of the 18th century, was one of the rediscoverers of the Acropolis. And Julien David Leroy wrote a small booklet called The History of the Disposition of All Churches since the antiquity to the present. In French, it's irresistible, it's Histoire de la disposition et des formes différentes que les chrétiens ont donné à nos temps depuis le règne de Constantin le Grand jusqu'à nous, which is a 10-line title, which is quite fascinating. But
let me just tell. So just for the students, so it's that guy who's spelled like Leroy. Leroy, do you remember if you remember that from class?
Yeah.
Leroy is the just
Leroy, but you know, Wa means king.
I don't want you to pronounce it that way. I just want to make sure everybody, because some
Yeah.
people will have familiarity with the text.
In French, I pronounce things properly. So normally this is le roi. But
We didn't pronounce it
English,
as you
no
were.
pretension. So what le roi says basically is one of the beauty of a cathedral is a colonnade, is that actually there is no fixed point of view, contrary to the traditional perspectival vision. And actually, to really experience the beauty of it, you have to move. And he explained that the changing perspective is the essential beauty, like in a forest, when you have lines of trees and you see actually how things change. And then you begin to understand something else. Not only it's the crowd, the real subject, the assembly of the people, it's the moving assembly of the people. And this goes, I don't have the time to go into more details, with this big shift in the 18th century in which mobility becomes good and immobility bad. Before that, politically, but also in physics, etc., the best thing was not to move. King on their throne did not move. God did not move. He put in motion things more imperfect, but he did not move, and etc. So immobility was a synonym of perfection. Now today, if we say of someone that he's static, it's less good than dynamic. So this big shift is actually an 18th century shift, which is linked to a lot of other things, like the invention of modern economics, the science of goods and values in movement, which is linked to ideas of social mobility. A society in which ranks are static is a bad society for us. A society in which ranks are permeable, people move up and down, is a good society. So, and these churches participate also to this movement. Okay? So you begin to understand how all these things are linked together. So now, the most troubling thing in all the writing about that they tell us that actually these churches reconcile also two models. One which is the Greek temple, and we're back to the primitive hut. But from the reference to the colonnade on, you have this idea of slenderness, performance, the very slender column, performance, etc. And we have these flying buttresses appearing. So the idea that there is another model with which it's blended, which is Gothic. Hence the fact that very often these things will be called Greco-Gothic churches. And then you begin to realize that this notion of structure is not at all a simple notion that is emerging, because it's actually a notion that will always be in tension between the reality of the construction and what appears as architectural tectonic. And you remember when I spoke about Sullivan yesterday, etc. Structure, as we know it, goes with always the possibility of a discrepancy between appearance and reality. In that case, what people say is that ornamentation is Greco-Roman, elegance is Greco-Roman, but structure is actually Gothic. The slenderness, the performance, these are Gothic. So you begin to see the complexity of what is beginning to appear. And of course, the problem for architecture then is that architecture is in danger of becoming schizophrenic. These are schizophrenic buildings. They look on the one hand to the Greek temple, on the other to the Gothic church. But by the end, what Sullivan does at the Wainwright is also a bit schizophrenic. In order to be very true to the essence of the steel frame, you have to cheat. So you begin to see how this notion is actually a complicated stuff. So why is, by the way, also the notion of structure emerging? Because actually they're absurd buildings. Because they're absurd, they actually make people also aware that a structure, there are a number of features. The first one is that a structure is based on a high degree of complementarity between the parts of the construction. There is it's not as redundant as before. When you have thick pillars, it's redundant. Stability is redundant. When you have thin columns, you must, for example, you have strong foundation, very dramatic foundation problem. If one column goes a bit down compared to the other, you will have disorders in the vault. So their very absurdity makes people aware of a new value, which is non-redundancy. And modern structure is fundamentally supposed to have a low degree of redundancy. Otherwise, it's not structure. Okay? So that's the first component. Second component goes with that kind of sublimity of danger overcome. And people say, you know, if one of the columns would give way, the church would be ruined. So the idea that a structure achieves a performance that is always playing on the brink of disaster. And you know, take cantilever, you know, a structure is not interesting if it's not playing a little bit with our nerves. Basically, if it's too hyperstatic, you know, big, fat, etc., not interesting. It's interesting when it begins to play a little bit with our nerve by saying, you know what, I'm really pushing it a little bit. And of course, we understand also that the way we push it is historically determined, because we push it in different ways according to the period. But that's something. And of course, solidity went with pushing it is not good, because it's going beyond the appearance of solidity. So there again, something new is appearing. And third idea, which goes with me, my flying buttresses, etc. The only way people begin to believe that these, and it's actually not true, but structurally, but the only way people begin to believe that these things can hold is because the thrust of the vault is partly counterbalanced at the periphery of the building by flying buttresses. Which means another thing, in order to become minimal, to really what they call in the 18th century, the non-redundancy, they call that economy of materials. In order to be minimal, a structure must put strains into stresses into movement. So a structure is just like people circulate in the church, within the structure, efforts to circulate and go actually from the vault to the periphery. And you have the beginning of these also very modern idea that, you know, a structure is actually something like a fluidic thing in which constraints, stresses, etc. circulate. So you have all these things that concatenate in these affairs. Am I clear? So I would argue that this is actually the starting point of things we will retain from those buildings. We will forget totally about these buildings as early as the early 19th century because they're absurd in some way. But the idea of a new type of coordination between the parts, the idea of a kind of non-redundancy, a high degree of non-redundancy, the correlated idea of something playing with risk and danger, the idea of a circulation of efforts, without which it's not interesting there again. These are ideas that will be determining in our modern notion of structure. Add to that Greek skeleton versus Greco-Roman trinkets, if you want, ornaments, and you begin to have the condition for what will be the approach, for example, of iron construction. And once again, this is linked to this big movement toward, you know, this new society, which is a civil society, no longer ruled only by the magnificence of God and kings, but which is a society taking consciousness of itself. This is the moment when, by the way, the sovereign begins to design to be the name of, you know, the political assembly of the people in many political writings. And in some ways, these churches, they're churches, but they're actually an integral part of this movement. There again, it's absurd that, you know, this movement would express itself through churches, which seems to be devoted only to the worship of God, but this is how it plays. So to go on the final buildings of that type of the Pantheon, which before that was actually, you remember I mentioned this project of Perrault of reconstruction of the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève. The Pantheon was actually initially built as the new church of the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève, which was finally begun to be reconstructed from the mid-18th century on by an architect named Sifflot. It was transformed during the Revolution and looks far more severe than what it was at the time because they, for example, closed the windows. So you have to imagine it was a much more you know, elegant building. But we find in this building pretty much the isolated columns. Look at the size of the vault and here the thinness here of the articulation. You have there again this desire of a kind of analytical approach to the building. The building has to do with this moving beauty of the colonnade. So with this idea of transparency, it is filled of iron, which is to these days one major source of problem because in stone iron rusts and expands and makes the stone explode, which makes actually the building quite dangerous. And finally, it has flying buttresses, which are hidden behind the external walls, but they are there. They have no structural role, but the architects of the time believed they had a structural role. It was a Greco-Gothic building. So you can see how this all goes. And it's interesting, by the way, that this kind of ultimate freestanding common church became the national pantheon devoted to the cult of the great men of the Republic. And this is where Rousseau and Voltaire were buried, during the Revolution. So you can see there again, you know, this kind of secularization of churches had a very concrete result in that case. Interestingly, also, the Pantheon was, there was a series of quarrels of whether it's not pushing this idea that, you know, the structure is, whether the structure is not pushed too far. For example, there was a huge quarrel. There are 3 domes in the Pantheon, a pretty heavy structure, on a very tiny here pillar. There is a residual pillar, but which is very tiny. There was a huge polemics during from the 1770s on that lasted for 20 years, whether it was buildable or not, whether it was not dangerous. And actually, an architect named Pierre Pat quarreled with Soufflot, saying that, you know, if you looked at the ratio between the diameter of cupola and the size of the pillars that supported them, it had always been comprised within certain limits. So an argument in the name of classical theory of proportion. To which Soufflot answered, and an engineer also wrote a letter in support of him that basically argued, look at nature. It can carry very big animals on very small skeletons. So imitating nature, we can go further and use other ways to understand things than classical proportion. What is at stake around the same time is the dramatic shift from geometry as the tool of construction to calculus. Because these structures will need actually to be calculated new tools, which are using integral and differential equations, and that will take something like 20 years, but this is what's going to happen. And to finish, this is just, the buildings have tons of problems, by the way. These are the cracks that developed during the Revolution. So the debates on the building raged until the early 1800s, and the building, you know, there were proposals also to destroy it. When you begin to understand a little bit the kind of tension that appears within the profession of construction and architecture is when you look at 2 solutions to fix the building. This one is by an architect called Brongniart, who built later the Stock Exchange in Paris. And basically, what he does is to thicken the pier. Okay? By putting a fake, it's an obelisk, but the function of the obelisk, of course, it has a funerary thing which looks good, funeral aspect, so it's an ornament fitted for Pantheon. But above all, it makes the thing fit. So what it does is actually to fix the proportion. And then you have another architect who does this very strange thing, which is actually to construct a giant flying buttress in order to make the circulation better and actually to derive the weight of the dome away from the central piers. So you can see here, you know, the mobility of proportion versus the mobility of efforts that is really put into play. So that was the end, and then what I just wanted to say, what happened later, very briefly. What happened later is an explosion of types of structure, pushing more and more, once again, the thing, and of course, iron played a role. As I said last time, iron is 60 times more resistant as an average than stone. So that created a dramatic departure from the traditional rules of solidity. Hence, throughout the 19th century, the problems of architecture with iron. Some embraced it, others were reluctant, and iron, by the way, got immediately enthusiastic reception from the people. Take the Crystal Palace, enthusiastically endorsed in 1850 by the people, but as interesting, the fact that Paxton never received the medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Because was it architecture? And of course, a lot of reluctance on the side of architect, and Ruskin also was very negative about the building, etc. And then also all kinds of surprising structure, like the cantilevered structure of the Forth Bridge, with also the appearance of a new, I spoke of analytic, of a new kind of language. Basically, second half of the 19th century, each time you see a tube, it means that it's in compression. Each time you see something else, it's in tension. because of course, tube resists better to compression. So, and this is something that begins to be understood and give birth to a new language and a new politics. Something also to note, this dramatic departure from the Vitruvian tradition. We have forgotten how suspension bridge were a visual drama. Because suspension bridge, usually you have this principle in the Vitruvian theory, what was called pyramidization. Basically large at the bottom and getting thinner at the top. So which was also expressed very often in treatises by the sturdy must carry the frail. Here the frail looking, but actually the sturdy in terms of real construction is the cable, which carries what is the sturdy visually, but frail in terms of resistance, which is the deck. So a total inversion, which explains why, in order to counterbalance that, very often they use massive Egyptian-like columns, as if, if you have the towers were Egyptian-like, it would still regain traditional solidity. So you can see, this is a bridge near Naples in the south of Italy of the 1830s something. And you can see here, the architect is actually trying to restore a classical idea of solidity. But of course, this cannot be solid. This is a cable. So you begin to see how adverse, how, structure is becoming a challenge, a constant challenge for architecture, which will be also a source of architectural creation, of course. Do I have 5 minutes more, or? Yeah. So, to understand again this connection between structure and society, let's take Viollet-le-Duc. For Viollet-le-Duc, structure is fundamentally an answer to a social problem. For example, the Gothic vault for Viollet-le-Duc, why did the Gothic have cathedrals with thin vaults? And he explained there are various reasons. First, and this is wrong by the way, because we now know how the cathedrals were built, and they are built by bishops, which are feudal lords. But Viollet-le-Duc believed that it was built by the people of the cities. So it was part of the democratization of urban life. So, and why was it important? Because people wanted to gather. So it's a distant heritage from this 18th century interpretation of the church as a gathering place. So the basilica. So which meant covering large spans, large surfaces. Second, because it was a democratic society, labor was expensive. So you had to spare labor. So hence, the lancet arch enables to have the same shape for each voussoirs, to standardize stone cutting, and to make an economy of labor. Thirdly, you have an economy also of materials, because at the thin vault with the ribs, so it's actually a kind of iron-like structure in which you have, it's a rib structure. And of course, one of the consequences is that you have to derive part of the efforts to the periphery and the flying buttresses, etc., etc. But you can see it's a social thing. And then Viollet-le-Duc proceeds in his lectures on architecture to explain to us how should we, I said yesterday that Gothic is not a style, neither even a constructive principle, it's a mode of reasoning. So his favorite example is, how would a medieval architect coming back in 19th century Paris propose new things, given the climate, the uses, etc. So it rains all the time in Paris. And so, like London. So one of the great things is to have this protruding second floor, which increases the inhabitable space, but also protects, like galleries, the ground floor. So this is what Gothic architect would do in the Middle Ages. So, so the Gothic architect, knowing that he's in the 19th century, will have the, it's still raining in Paris, people are still walking along the street, so it's a good program. But so then let's translate it using the materials of the time, and hence this oblique column that Viollet-le-Duc suggests. And then, since our guy is a rational, is the prototype of a rational medieval architect, working in the 19th century, discovers that actually 19th century people needs gathering place for new type. But then he will expand, so he begins to expand that to this kind of proposal, and in order for you to be fully aware, people are dressed in medieval clothes, but this is a 19th century building using a medieval constructive principle, so we're back to this idea. And of course he invents the pilotis, actually. And then I say, you know, cathedral for the 19th century, meeting places, assembly hall, etc. So this is the next transposition with the rib vault of the present, which is actually cast iron, because Viollet-le-Duc still imagined that cast iron will remain predominant when he writes this book. But you understand how structural imagination for him is also social imagination and political imagination. That explains also why great structural feat were seen as national symbol of national pride. Let it be the Eiffel Tower in 1889, or something we have a bit forgotten today, how the Brooklyn Bridge was actually the symbol of the rising United States, and how all over the world structure was part of that. So I think I could stop there, but what I wanted to say then is, you know, the further development of structural thought, with all the diversity, the zoo of 20th century creation, and the, in some ways the generalization of structure. In the 20th century, what happened is that structure conquered everything at every level, before, in some ways, entering into a kind of crisis because it had extended beyond what it was even in the 19th century. The expansion can be seen, for example, in Darcy Thompson. Everything is structural, you know, from the micro shell to the macro structure of the world. And you can still find that in Kepes. When Kepes in the 1960s publishes the structure in the arts and science, everything is structure from crystal, metallography to human structure. But Kepes already, we begin to see that from structure we're passing slowly to patterns. And actually patterns are information based. They're no longer circulation of efforts based. And you can see that already something is beginning to go wrong with structure, which does not prevent structure to generalize even beyond what we knew with stone structure, inflatable structure, pneumatic structure, tensile structure. This is the Karlsruhe, how in Germany one of the first tensile structure, tensegrity structure and the big domes, Georgia, etc. And even deployable structure. When Pinero invented that kind of thing, it seemed without any use. A kind of, you know, deployable are basically the generalization of scissors and unwrap. And people thought it would be of no use except fun. But actually, they've been used in various major projects these days. So these zoo, and then the passage, trying to recapture the social nature of the affair, the megastructure, which is the ultimate and probably last moment in which structure tried to encapsulate the values of society. The structure as the city, the structure as the world. But what is interesting is that the megastructure at some point, and this is something Hadassah studied on archigram, begin to destroy itself. Because in some ways, it becomes so expanded that it becomes to be self-diluting. And we see after that, you know, in some ways, the next stage, and this idea of structure as connection, social connection, that is borrowed to the system, we see structure as a kind of more and more enigmatic thing, and then structure disappears in a kind of equipped surface. And this is the beginning of the era we now know. So you remember what I said about the crisis of concrete structure. What I would like to say, added to what I said yesterday, I think the fundamental problem of tectonic today is often, is not really, I think where a lot of people have it wrong, in my opinion, is that they forget that structure was rooted in the social and political dimension, based in it. So the real problem today is not what kind of ingenious new structural device should we invent to salvage the notion of structure. It would be more, how do we relate, again, any kind of tectonic expression to a social and political message? What is the social and political relevance today of structural thought? And that's the question, because we no longer believe that Brooklyn Bridge or Eiffel Towers can encapsulate the spirit of the age. We are become more critical with this kind of thing. And probably today, you know, it's more Facebook than a classical structure that will encapsulate what we believe is true about society. So I'll stop there. I had a few images more, but I think it's probably better to stop here and try to have a conversation.
Yes? Touch on what you just ended with there. You mentioned kind of this importance of relating today's tectonic structure to a political, social context. How do you position that versus relating versus inventing the tectonic?
I think you must do both. Take the space structure. They were inseparable in the 1950s and 1960s from desire of flexibility, random encounter in very large spaces, all these ideas of a new freedom, etc. I think in some ways the problem of tectonic today is we don't know what we want. We do, and I think this is one of the strangest things for me. Why has civil engineering been more resistant in terms of the role of structure? Because in civil engineering, the sheer usefulness of a bridge, for example, is not something disputable. Whereas in architecture, it's always more complicated because you have to transpose need into meaning. And that's a complicated thing. But, I think many of the failure of the new tectonic, and actually those who try, this discourse on swarm tectonics like Leach and others, try to relate it to social issues. The problem is that they're a big lid in that relation, and they just think that magic buzzwords will be enough. Yes?
Earlier in your lecture, you mentioned how the church was secularized, and you mentioned that a key aspect of that was transparency, visual transparency, and you pulled it from the theater of the day. But I mean, it seems, to me anyway, that the emergence of royal societies, as what Peter Galison argues, objectivity theaters, where the act of observing the observation itself became kind of confirmation.
Sure.
And the act did also, and so on one hand you could say that the church was being secularized in some respect, but conversely there was also a moral agenda to what training the eye to see truly would mean. So in that way, it seems more like they're in a dance, that the church may have been secularized slightly to its observation, the definition of observation, but conversely science was deified in a way, or brought into the religious sphere because of the moral sensibility of what being a witness to, or learning how to train oneself to see properly meant.
I think you've read Leviathan and the Air Palm. I'm not sure science was deified immediately. I think it came later. Because if you remember the argument around Boyle, etc., and the Royal Society is precisely that it's a social bond between good faith, well-informed, etc., observer. And hence, by the way, the transparency of the gaze that enable everyone to share the experiment is part of that. And it's in a way not so far from the 18th century church. What it is about is creating, in a way, transferring sovereignty from the transcendental revelation of a power exterior to society itself, accepting rules of engagement with itself, etc. So science is not so far. And actually, I would argue that in the 18th century, secularization and science are together. And then it's later, in my opinion, in the 19th century, that the great mythification of science as the new religion began to emerge. In a century that, by the way, was totally obsessed by religion, the century that wrote the largest amount of literature on religion is actually the 19th century, which is also the century that built a number of churches. If you want to understand probably what happened, you have probably to switch to the 19th century, where you had a double movement in which religion tried to reestablish itself and succeeded in some countries and not in others. And in parallel, science emerged as a new spiritual power. It's a bit later. I would argue that actually my churches, and that's the reason I took actually the theme of the amphitheater is something that circulates from the anatomy, the surgical theater, to the assembly, political assembly room. And what I'm arguing is that theater belongs to that, and churches are actually, with their quest for transparency, have a link with this universe, which is visibility, mutual visibility, shared vision.
You mentioned that the the kind of solution to the problem of tectonics was relating the social issue to the issue of structure, correct?
Yeah, but not in a naive way. That's
Right,
to say, using perhaps metaphor, but still having a project. Yes.
So I'm wondering who, not necessarily in a metaphor is what you're saying, but who is the audience for that observation? Or who is the audience of that critique that we'd be offering as part, like, for example, you mentioned Leduc. He said the audience was the people because they were the ones that designing it, but as you mentioned, that actually wasn't the case. So was the people the audience and the bishop the performer in that situation, or is the relationship more complicated than that?
Well, the answer is always it's more complicated, but that's because I'm an historian. But let me try to take a little bit, because it's a really good question. A couple of things that I may add on structure is that structure is a strange mix of democratic sharing of the experience and totally anti-democratic competence. Because what structure will operate is also to distinguish sharply between those who can truly understand structure and calculate it, those who know, the engineers, the experts, the scientists, etc., and those who just gawk at the magnitude of the effect. And in some ways, structure is both linked to a kind of democratic desire, but it's a democratic experience produced in non-democratic ways, if you like. And if you think the Eiffel Tower is designed by a guy who's an engineer, and then it's shared as a public entertainment. That's, by the way, one of the great ambiguity. In some ways, if I was to be very negative on structure, I could say that it belongs to the realm of spectacle in the Debord way. But I think there was something more genuine, hence the fact that, World Fair were such a display of major structural achievements. And with a certain idea of democracy, even if World Fair were not ultimately democratic in our sense. Today, I think it's complicated. I don't think, if you say I'm going to design a structure for the people, it's going usually to be a very bad structure, which is the same when you try too much to save the world with architecture, you end up with bad architecture. But you have to have a concern for saving the world that you express through the architecture, etc. So it's the same for structure. It's a complex balance between the symbolic and the effective, between a lot of things. Yes?
Well, I'd like to pick up on that. On the Eiffel Tower, I'm reminded of a story that I don't know if it's apocryphal, but Guy de Maupassant supposedly ate lunch there every day, and he hated the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, sorry?
Guy de Maupassant. And he was asked, why do you eat lunch there every day? And he said, because it's the only place in Paris I don't have to see them. But I actually wanted to ask you about another work of Eiffel's. I was really intrigued by this kind of breathless survey of so many works at the very end, this big departure from everything that preceded it. And I had been thinking about the Statue of Liberty, both as something that conjoins the two countries because of its movement from one to the other context, but as representing all these kinds of ambiguous presences in its kind of false solidity above and true solidity in the pedestal, in the need of a public campaign to bring about that pedestal, in the kind of inhabitation of the structure on the inside and the kind of denial of it from the outside. So very different from the tower. And I don't know where you would place that in the sense of its kind of representation of both solidity and structure in terms of democracy and all these kinds of convergences. What you're
I think it would fit in I didn't have the idea to use the Statue of Liberty, but it's actually, I think it would fit very nicely with this dialectic of the hidden and the visible to everyone, the shared and the specific to some competences, etc. By the way, the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty have something in common. They're both bridge pier, basically. The fundamental idea of the Eiffel Tower, it's a giant bridge pier which lost its deck. No, but it's literally that. It's very literally, and it was not actually, the idea is not from Eiffel, it's from 3 employees from Eiffel who, were drinking too much and had, did a little sketch, and actually Eiffel bought the idea. But one thing Eiffel knew was how to be systematic, so he bought it, built it, etc. And the Statue of Liberty, there is a big debate actually, because on the structure it's interesting, by the way, because there were people who proposed to have a statue which would hold like a shell. And the Eiffel solution is actually, and others who had a pure one skeleton. And Eiffel is a kind of ambiguous hybrid in which you have a bridge pier in the middle. The only thing is that usually bridge pier do not raise an arm. And the arm was a problem from the start and was what had to be fixed when they renovated the statue, etc. But it's fundamentally a bridge pier. That's the primary structure. Then you have a secondary structure which looks a bit like a space frame. And then you have the third shell-like structure. So it's a kind of hybrid. And I would say it fit for me pretty well between both these very social and political nature. It's really a political thing, this whole affair. From in the initial gift by the French, and at a moment in which there is the rivalry with Germany, so to resurrect the great friendship, etc., has also some meaning in that period. So there are all kinds of political connotation on the side of America. Paying for the pedestal is an issue, etc. We all know that. So I think also with this question, and at the same time this question of the hidden, this question of the concealed is very important. Truth is, a structure is by definition an ambiguous thing. Let me give you another example. A structure, everything in some ways can be described as a structure, but the fact is, their structure we're usually not interested in. You take an engineer, a heap of sand, except he's a modern physicist, and modern physics is really interested in sand and all materials like that, but classical structural engineer, a heap of sand is not interested in. So when it's too natural, it's boring in some ways. So if you begin to build a kind of super Mickey Mouse statue extending 1 kilometer large, it's absurd. So the too counter-natural is also not interesting. So the reality is that a structure is always a negotiation between the too natural and boring and the too counter-natural and absurd. And the proportion has varied throughout the centuries. For example, I wanted a long time ago actually to write a book on giant statues in the 19th century. Why is it that the 19th century got totally obsessed with giant statues? And the reason is, in my opinion, the strong return of the symbolic in the 19th century. How to reconcile the symbolic. And in some ways, there again, there is a complementarity between the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty, because the Eiffel Tower is a symbol without a surrounding meaningful shape. It's a symbol in itself, just like the Brooklyn Bridge. But there is a debate in the 19th century on whether this can really be a symbol or whether you don't have to clad it with something that resembles a human being or whatever. But that's a good example.
So, you talk about kind of this truth to the structure of it, the ambiguity of it, the symbol of it, and I can't help but think about the non-symbolic piece of work, not the Eiffel Tower, or not Statue of Liberty, but more looking towards architectural constructions, vernacular constructions. And you even suggested in your slideshow today, there's this deceitful nature to construction, that it's never true to what it is.
No.
And I guess I'm curious about the implications to this. You talk about the democracy of understanding the building. When you get into this false understanding of the purity of the structure, what is the...
Well, the implication is probably because I am French, and love is based on a lot of lies. No, but to be more serious, it's because most things are seldom univoc. And if we take architecture, by the end, architecture is a static, produces usually static object, despite all the obsession of Patrice Fuller and others to have it moved, to have them moved. But most objects are static, but they are not static in their meaning, in the fact that they're always transmutation of one thing into the other. You think in some ways what interests me in these churches is that they are primitive art becoming churches. And their meaning is that is linked to the fact that the primitive art is still showing through the columns. That architecture is seldom, it's like transparency, you know. I think one of the things Yves Blanc and others have shown on transparency in architecture is not pure phenomenological transparency. It's unfolding transparency. And it means that constructive truth is not a once and for good truth. It's actually an unfolding process. And if you want to understand something, in my opinion, to architecture, you have to understand this kind of dynamic condition. In some ways, this is where, and God knows you'll realize that tomorrow, that I like the experiments linked to digital media, digital architecture. But one of the problems very often is that people believe that the movement of the software, you know, in some ways what Lynn used to call animation is enough. But there is the need for a symbolic animation that transmutes constantly something into something else in architecture. Otherwise you miss something profound in architecture. And you miss also, there is also a kind of dynamic, even at the experiential level, you know, transparency in architecture is always something about to become opaque. And if it is not about to become opaque, then it has no real interest as a transparent thing. And so you need always these inner contradictions that fuel in some ways the architectural experience. And structure was one of the means. What I call the crisis of tectonics of structure is the crisis, not that we don't need structured thing anymore, you know, when you ride a bicycle, it's still necessary to have a structured frame, etc. But it's that structure, as we knew it, is no longer one of the fuels of, you know, the kind of architectural engine which feeds on contradiction. Yes, and yes, perhaps, since you, and then you, okay?
Well, it's in some ways related to the last question. I think the example of Leduc was interesting. I mean, I'm just very curious where you see common construction in this period being situated within these larger epistemological shifts. Because in some ways, we're talking about a context, or at least in the examples you're talking about, certainly they are either they try to kind of evoke democracy, they've tried to speak to it in some way. In the case of Leduc, they're also, you know, he's imagining the Gothic cathedrals being constructed by the people in a sense. But how do you know, I'm just curious in this period, where is the kind of culture of common construction in all of this, which I suppose now is what we call the vernacular, but was in no sense referred to as such in that time. I mean, how do you also make sense of that as somebody who thinks about structure in this time? Do you know what I'm saying? Because,
yeah, I understand your
because
question.
certainly, because the kind of examples we're looking at were also not happening in a kind of vacuum. They were
yeah, but I would say there again, you know, these, you have to realize that temporalities are not the same from one domain to another. What I described was a relatively sophisticated kind of architecture, etc. That's it. So you would say it doesn't concern the people, etc. That's a first thing in the 18th century. For example, the quarrels like the Pantheon are actually a general phenomenon of the 18th century. There is, by the mid-18th century, a huge quarrel about St. Peter's stability, which involve, and there are a number of public quarrels. So the public, which is still the enlightened public, but you know, beyond the circle of experts, of architects, etc., you have a growing number of people who get involved into those polemics. Would be a first answer. Second answer, if you look not at the scale even of one generation, but let's say at the scale of a century, these mid-18th century, late 18th century debate will give birth to 19th century iron construction approaches, which will then give birth to frames. Where do you think our approach of buildings in terms of frame, which really concerned a lot of people everywhere, came from? It came from this kind of radical, of course it came from the tradition of wooden construction, etc., but it came also from these kind of things which percolate more or less rapidly into the greater public at large. Just like digital architecture today concerns very few people, actually. If you go out there, we still live in parallelepipedic boxes. Doesn't mean that we will stop living in those boxes, but you know, look already, it's beginning to percolate through, for example, shops. A lot of shops, spaces, ultras, etc., are presenting people with new spatial realities. It percolates also through manufactured objects who begin to have these soft, strange forms. And ultimately, you may wonder, you know, it may take sometimes, perhaps no longer a century, but it may take 50 years for things to totally unfold. And it's not necessarily, I don't want to go into a theory of the avant-garde. It's more, you know, I would rather have a theory of a kind of emergence thing. That you have burgeoning stems here and there, and that, you know, but through ripples, it diffuses. It's not the classical theory of the avant-garde, which goes with people understanding better, etc. I think it's another model of diffusion, of singularities, if you know, that I like to have. But once again, you know, of course, if you look at the time of Le Bleu, it concerned, but you know, this is 18th century France, it's what? It's 25 million people left. Of these 25 million people, of course, only a few hundred thousands are really concerned directly by those things. But 100 years later, a number of people can understand what a structure is, and millions of people will see the Eiffel Tower and understand it as a structure. So, you know, and I could also argue that what is actually have a broader vision of that. Well, I think what is taking place is also the precondition for us to understand the world in terms of infra and superstructure, which is beyond, this is why I say that I'm treating the French case, but it's a more general issue. You know, in some case, this kind of dissociation is also what makes the kind of Marxist belief that there are superstructural and infrastructural things possible. The belief of the 19th century that there are things which are superficial and you have things which really support them is, so you see once again, it's a complex, and not to say that propagation is not complex, it is. And actually this is where also, by the way, the danger of for architects today is to believe that, you know, the only proper way to be social is, once again, to save the planet immediately. You know, architects, you know, for example, you know, we're going to have severe hydraulic problems. But I don't think architects, and my colleague Pierre Bélanger, for example, goes on saying we should become like the Army Corps of Engineers and fix that through a global approach to design, etc. I think actually it's a mistake. Because, you know, if you really want to be into hydraulics, you go into hydraulics. If you, design has to remain in tension with that. Because what design does do not necessarily follow the laws of simple propagation. Okay? You had a question?
Yeah, no, I was actually really fascinated by the linguistic analysis done by the engineer, where it looked like he was almost trying to get at an language, you know, foundational language through this kind of structure.
Yeah, which is a sensationalist. It's actually the great project of 18th century philosophy from Locke. You know, the Locke's project is to understand better how we reason.
But then doesn't this, I mean, if you're talking about structure, this then actually represents a kind of immediate abstraction of what structure means, away from the tectonic model that you were talking about earlier. What is this tectonic structure? So it becomes, and you said later on, of course, when you get to Capitist, structure has become everywhere. I mean, not only in terms of Capitist's analysis of natural forms and other forms, but more importantly, you know, Piaget publishes almost the same year his structuralism, which is sociology, philosophy, linguistics, biology, mathematics. You know, there's this drive to push structure to its abstract meaning. At the same time, that notion of structure takes upon itself a kind of connotation of a principle of relationships and organization. So in following that arc, is inevitable that it would become pattern, and that perhaps the pattern is the tectonic structure of the contemporary world.
Well, definitely, if you look at the genealogy, yes, one led to the other. In some ways, structure led to the notion of information in some ways, but then information killed what had engendered it.
And my argument is that an informational world is not a structural world in the classical sense. Because structure, and there is another source of ambiguity, by the way, because structuralism is very often a kind of systemic approach. So, and structure and system is not exactly the same with complex things. I think what got lost at a certain point was effects of scale. That's to say, structure could be gigantic, but they had still this relation to a kind of hypertrophied understanding of the body. In some ways, the pattern is already beyond the body. And with a pattern, you begin to see the question of the post-human that leads to. That could be another way to understand it. Whereas structure is still very much in relation with a kind of idea of the skeleton, which is related to the body, etc., etc. Whereas pattern, you enter a new world, actually, even if you don't realize it immediately. It's true that in Kepesh you have a mishmash of pretty much everything, you know, structuralism, structure in the art, etc., etc. But I think the outcome finally is where we are today, which is, you know, a real question whether the world of information is not ultimately meant for a post-human condition.
Do you think that this kind of scalar condition originates approximately in the 18th century with the rise of both microscopy?
No, I think it's a recent issue. I'll come back to this issue tomorrow when we'll discuss digital question. This is something I've written at length in my book. On digital culture, I think we are in the middle of a radical destabilization of scale. We'll come back to that tomorrow, but I think it's a huge problem today. The 19th century invented gigantism. What we have invented is beyond gigantism, which is a profound interdetermination of scale, which goes with the ultra-gigantic, of course, but the ultra-gigantic is not the most difficult thing to conceptualize. What is difficult to conceptualize is the lack of fixed scale, which is another problem for architecture, because architecture, you know, when I was in this conference on infrastructure, you have today really, in my opinion, in architecture, two schools of thought. The one who think that we are heading toward a general design condition, in which we design the planet, we design food, and in between we design buildings, and that's profoundly the same activity, which was a little bit Buxminster theoretic and others, etc. That's a little bit Sanford Quinter's position, etc., to give a few words. My position is completely different. I do think that to design a spoon, even if Thompson architect can design spoons, it's not exactly the same as design building, and it's not the same as designing bridges. So I'm more interested actually in the differences in culture within the continent of design than the similarities, even though they are similarities, you know, a kind of problem-solving kind of attitude, a kind of openness. There are all kinds of things that relate these various domains. But I'm more interested in the differences. And it's true that today, where Stanford and others are not totally wrong, I think there is a crisis of the traditional boundaries. But it doesn't mean for me necessarily that we have to abandon them. And that goes to me with this question of scale, which is actually a fundamental professional question. You know, let's be clear. I don't necessarily always believe that, you know, these relate directly to the fate of the largest fraction of the population. I do think that many of the things I'm trying to evoke have a very direct professional impact. Yes.
Sorry to bring the conversation back a few points, but I had a follow-up on Jordan's comment and the one on animation, as far as these gigantic statues from the 19th century. And I wondered where you rank the statue that was built to actually one-up the Eiffel Tower, which was the Ferris wheel, the animated statue from the 19th century. And even though that
Ferris wheel, for me, it's very close to the Eiffel Tower, by the way. It's a kind of Eiffel Tower thing, which is, by the way, linked to pleasure. You know, one other thing we've forgotten a little bit is how 19th century structure is also something that moves constantly from pleasure to hyper-utilitarian. Take the Eiffel Tower, it's derived from the ultimately utilitarian thing, which is a bridge pier. And it's a pier for nothing but pleasure. And which, you know, this is where Archigram, the dear Archigram of Hadas, still relate to 19th century culture, in which you have these huge structures which are for pleasure and utility at the same time. But the Ferris wheel is, for me, quite typical of that. And it's also symbolic, for sure, like the Eiffel Tower.
Well, thank you. It's 1
you.
o'clock, so.
Thank you very much.